San Francisco Bay, June 1962. A heavy, relentless fog swallowed the horizon. The freezing waters crashed hard against the rocks along the slopes of Alcatraz. The sound was almost deafening. What was supposed to be just another ordinary night inside the most secure prison in the world ended in a completely different way. 3 men had simply disappeared. What makes this story even more remarkable is not the escape itself, but where they escaped from. Alcatraz was not an ordinary prison. At the time, it was considered the most secure maximum security prison ever built. The US government declared that the facility existed to prove that no human being would ever be capable of escaping. And yet, 3 individuals managed to do exactly that. How did they get out? How did they survive those waters? And what happened afterward? These were the questions that haunted investigators. To truly understand this escape, we first need to understand what Alcatraz Island actually was. It is an island located in the middle of San Francisco Bay, California, United States. Initially, it was used as a military base, and only later converted into a maximum security prison. The island sat just over 2 kilometers from the mainland. It sounds close, but the current cutting across that bay was treacherous in a way that defied human instinct. Those waters didn't push you away, they pulled you down. Experienced divers reported that swimming there felt like trying to cross a river while wearing lead boots. The water was cold and deceptive, rarely exceeding 12 degrees Celsius even during summer. Alcatraz housed inmates other prisons couldn't handle. It was the last place any criminal wanted to end up, the final step before nothingness. Escape artists, riot instigators, and those the system had essentially given up on. Alcatraz became their last stop. Frank Morris was one of those individuals. By age 10, he had already been expelled from shelters multiple times. He began committing crimes as a child, small ones at first, gradually becoming more sophisticated and frequent. Not necessarily violent, but calculated. Frank Morris wasn't just any criminal, he was meticulous, almost engineering-minded in how he operated. The Anglin brothers, John and Clarence, came from Georgia. They grew up in a poor farming family and learned early that rules often applied only to those with something to lose. They were inseparable in a way that unsettled guards. They seemed to communicate without speaking. 3 men met at Alcatraz, and within months were planning something no one had accomplished in the prison's 26 years of operation. The plan was disturbingly simple in concept and incredibly complex in execution. For months, every night, they scraped the concrete around their cell ventilation grills using spoons and improvised metal tools. The noise was masked by music played during recreation hours. Guards walked past the cells and saw nothing because the holes were covered with cardboard painted to match the exact color of the concrete. Their plan was executed carefully every single day. They also created something no one expected inside a maximum security prison: life vests and an inflatable raft. Made from more than 50 stolen raincoats, hidden under laundry sheets, they stitched them using improvised needles and sealed them with glue. They also crafted fake heads using real hair collected from the prison barbershop, glued onto soap sculptures and painted. These were placed in their beds to fool guards during nighttime inspections. Neither prisoners nor guards believed something like this was possible. They were executing a plan that would later inspire Hollywood films, all built inside their own cells. In the early hours between June 11 and 12, 1962, Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers crawled through the wall openings, climbed plumbing structures to the roof, descended the outer side, and reached the water's edge. The next morning, when guards tried to wake the 3 men, the heads in the beds didn't respond. The prison went into lockdown. The FBI was called. The Coast Guard surrounded the bay. Helicopters swept the coastline. For years, the FBI tried to prove they had died. The logic seemed simple. Survival was impossible. The water was freezing. The raft was fragile. The current was deadly. They must have drowned, their bodies carried away by the ocean. Case closed. But there's a problem with that narrative. In 1975, an anonymous letter surfaced mentioning details about the escape that had never been made public. Then, in 2013, the Anglin family contacted authorities claiming they had received a photograph taken in Brazil in 1975. 2 older men whose features resembled John and Clarence, living somewhere in South America. Facial recognition analysis was inconclusive. It neither confirmed nor ruled it out. In 2015, Researchers from the National Oceanographic Institute recreated the conditions of that night using real data from June 1962. Their conclusion was unsettling. If the three men had entered the water before 11 p.m., the current at that hour would likely have carried them north across the bay directly toward the shoreline. Under those conditions, survival was plausible. There is no certainty, and there likely never will be, but that absence of certainty is what keeps this story alive. There is a detail about the escape that almost no one knows. The plan wasn't designed by three men. It was four. Alan West was the fourth conspirator. He worked for months alongside Morris and the Anglins, digging and fabricating the necessary materials. In fact, West was the one who suggested using raincoats to build the raft. He helped design it. He proposed escaping across the roof and devised how to reach it unseen. But on the night of the escape, his ventilation hole was too small. He had started digging later than the others. That delay became crucial. By the time he managed to enlarge the opening, the others were already climbing toward the roof. When he finally reached it, they had disappeared into the dense fog. West stood there for a moment in the cold darkness, looking down at the black, violent water crashing below. And then he made the only decision left to him. He climbed back down. The next morning, when the alarm sounded, Alan West was the first to speak to the FBI. He confessed everything: the plan, the tools, the materials, the escape route. Since he hadn't escaped, confession was his only leverage. West remained imprisoned for years and later died of natural causes in another facility. He never learned what happened to the others. He was one of the architects of the escape, and the only one who didn't make it. When the FBI officially closed the case in 2013, not everyone agreed. David Widner, a nephew of the Anglin brothers, spent decades gathering evidence on his own. He traveled to Brazil, interviewed witnesses, analyzed photographs. To him, the case being closed wasn't the end. In 2015, he submitted a new letter to the FBI, supposedly written by John Anglin in 2013. In it, the writer claimed to have cancer and offered to surrender in exchange for medical treatment and a reduced sentence. The FBI analyzed the letter. They couldn't confirm its authenticity, but they also couldn't prove it was a fraud. Investigators point to something simple: no bodies, no clothing, no remains. In most failed Alcatraz escape attempts, something eventually surfaced. Not in June 1962. Marine current experts who worked the case for years concluded something intriguing. The absence of bodies does not prove survival, but it also does not match the usual drowning patterns in that bay. The absence proves nothing. It's just another hole in the wall, painted the color of concrete. In the 1960s, Alcatraz was more than a prison. It was a political statement, a message to organized crime, to rebels, to anyone who believed they could challenge the system. Here, you come to stay. Here, the system always wins. 26 years without a successful escape. That was the Department of Justice statistic. The island, the water, the cold, the current. Those were the most reliable guards of all. When Morris and the Anglins vanished, it wasn't just a security failure. It was a fracture in what Alcatraz represented. Three men, using nothing more than spoons, raincoats, and an accordion as cover noise, rewrote the message. 1 year later, Alcatraz closed. Officially, it was too expensive, 3 times the cost of operating a comparable mainland prison. That was true. But internally, another reason circulated. A fortress that can be defeated is no longer a fortress. The last prisoner left Alcatraz on the 21st of March 1963. Today, it is a national park receiving more than 1 million visitors a year. Many of them stop at Frank Morris's cell. They look at the patched concrete and try to imagine doing that with a spoon. Unresolved cases disturb us differently than solved ones. When there's a body, a confession, a verdict, the mind closes the drawer and moves on. But what happens when the drawer never closes? The 1,962 Alcatraz escape remains alive for one specific reason. There is no proof of failure. No body. No confession. No confirmed endpoint. Only the bay unchanged, indifferent, holding everything. Or holding nothing. The Anglin family still lives in the southern United States. Some have given interviews over the years. Their belief never changed. They think John and Clarence made it. Not because they have proof, but because they knew them. That certainty isn't evidence. The FBI officially closed the case in 2013, 51 years after the escape. The justification was technical. The fugitives would be over 80 years old, and even if alive, they no longer posed a threat to the public. Case archived. Never solved. Perhaps they didn't survive those dark waters, or perhaps they reached the other side and then disappeared forever. What is certain is that this escape changed how the world views prisons, how governments think about security, and what we consider truly impossible to escape.